of one of America's great and legendary entertainers, the King of Hidey-Ho, Cab Calloway.
In 1931, Cab Calloway thought he was just writing a fun song with a catchy hook. Then, the FBI started watching him. What they discovered in the song lyrics was a dangerous secret about drugs, addiction, and death. But that wasn't even the craziest part. From million-dollar success to brutal police beatings, we're revealing what really happened to the man who dared to sing about America's darkest truths. Cab Calloway was born on December 25, 1907, in Rochester, New York, into a family that believed in education and hard work. His father was a lawyer and real estate agent. His mother was a teacher and church organist. They wanted their children to aim high, to build stable careers, to follow paths that promised respect. But Cab was different. When he was 5, the family moved to Baltimore, settling in a neighborhood where black culture thrived. Music, business, and art filled the streets. It was the kind of place that could shape a person's dreams. Cab's parents hoped he would follow his father into law, but music had already found him. By the time he was 14, his voice stood out. His parents arranged private singing lessons, believing he might use his talent in church or some formal setting. What they didn't expect was that Cab would fall in love with jazz. Jazz was loud. It was wild. It had a life of its own, and Cab wanted to be part of it. His parents disapproved, but that didn't stop him. He started sneaking into Baltimore's nightclubs, watching musicians command the stage, feeling the energy of a packed crowd. By 17, he was more than just a fan. He joined Johnny Jones and his Arabian Tent Orchestra as a singer and drummer. He was still in high school, still playing basketball, but his heart was already elsewhere. If anyone understood his passion, it was his older sister, Blanche. She wasn't just involved in jazz, she was leading it. She was one of the first women to front an all-male orchestra, touring the country, proving that jazz wasn't just for men. By 1923, she was performing in the hit revue Plantation Days, and when Cab graduated in 1925, she invited him to join her. This was his first real step into show business. Watching Blanche succeed made everything feel possible. She wasn't just his sister, she was proof that he could make it too. His parents still weren't convinced. They pushed him to enroll in Crane College in Chicago to study law. He agreed, but his nights belonged to music. He performed at Chicago's hottest jazz clubs, places like the Sunset Cafe and Dreamland Ballroom. That's where he met Louis Armstrong. That's where he learned scat singing, a fast and playful improvisation that would later become his signature. By 1928, he had a choice to make. He could stay in school, follow the life his parents wanted, or he could take a chance on music. He chose music. He took over leadership of the Alabamians, a struggling band with heart, and left college behind. It was a gamble. It was uncertain. But for Cab Calloway, the stage was the only place he wanted to be. In 1930, he stepped into the spotlight when he became the leader of the Missourians, a jazz band already known in Harlem's music scene. But when Calloway took over, everything changed. The band wasn't just playing jazz anymore, it was putting on a show. His arrival wasn't quiet. A battle of the bands at the Savoy Ballroom reportedly sealed his place as the leader. Soon after, the group was rebranded as Cab Calloway and his orchestra, marking the start of something new. Calloway was more than a band leader. He was a performer in every sense. His voice moved effortlessly between smooth melodies and rapid-fire scat singing. He didn't just sing a song, he brought it to life, filling every note with humor, drama, and personality. As the orchestra's reputation grew, they found themselves playing at Harlem's most famous venues. Then, in 1931, Calloway landed an opportunity that would change everything. Duke Ellington, who had been leading the house band at the legendary Cotton Club, was going on tour. Calloway was chosen as a temporary replacement. But once he stepped onto that stage, there was no going back. The Cotton Club was no ordinary venue. It was the center of Harlem's nightlife, a place where the biggest names in jazz performed. The audience, however, was almost entirely white. due to the club's segregationist policies. Black musicians played for the crowds, but were not allowed to sit among them. Even with these barriers, the club was a gateway to national fame. Weekly radio broadcasts sent its music across America, turning local performers into stars. Radio took his fame even further. Twice a week, his voice reached homes across the country, bringing the spirit of Harlem to people who had never set foot in the city. Unlike many band leaders who focused purely on the music, Calloway knew how to entertain through sound alone. His energy, his humor, and his signature vocal style made every broadcast feel alive. Then came the song that would define his career, Minnie the Moocher. Released in 1931, it became a groundbreaking hit, but its origins go back further. The song was inspired by an old folk tune called Willie the Weeper, a story about a drug-addicted man who escaped his reality through opium-fueled dreams. Calloway took that idea, changed the perspective, and turned it into something unforgettable. Instead of Willie, the song followed Minnie, a woman full of life and energy who eventually fell into addiction. She was described as a red-hot hoochie coocher, a term used for provocative dancers at the time. She met Smokey, a man known as a cokey, which meant he used cocaine. Under his influence, Minnie started kicking the gong around, a phrase that meant smoking opium. Like Willie before her, she drifted into fantasy, dreaming of golden homes and diamond cars. But those dreams didn't last. The song's final moments repeated the same mournful words, "Poor Min, poor Min," a tragic end to a once vibrant life. By the time Calloway recorded Minnie the Moocher, he was already making a name for himself at Harlem's Cotton Club. His performances were electric, filled with movement, energy, and his signature scat singing. The famous "Hi-de-he-de-he-de-ho" wasn't even planned. During a live show, Calloway forgot the lyrics and improvised. The audience loved it, so he kept it in the song. That moment of spontaneity became one of the most iconic parts of his career. The song carried deeper messages hidden within its playful rhythm. Calloway used jive slang, a language that thrived in Harlem's jazz culture. To most listeners, Minnie the Moocher sounded fun and lighthearted. But for those who understood the coded language, the meaning was clear. Minnie wasn't just a dancer. She was a woman caught in a dangerous world, surrounded by addiction and false promises. Her dreams of luxury were just illusions, fading as quickly as they appeared. This ability to blend entertainment with raw storytelling was what made Minnie the Moocher so powerful. The song's energy was contagious, yet its message was unshakable. Calloway performed it with such charm and excitement that most audiences never realized how dark the story really was. He had found a way to slip a cautionary tale into a song that made people sing and dance. That was his genius. When the song was released, it defied expectations. The Great Depression had crushed the music industry, and record sales were struggling. But Minnie the Moocher soared past those challenges. It became the first record by an African-American artist to sell over 1 million copies. It wasn't just a hit. It was a turning point. It proved that jazz, a genre born from black culture, could dominate the mainstream. Calloway's success paved the way for future generations of black musicians who fought to be recognized in an industry that often shut them out. Over the years, the song never faded. It remained a jazz classic, earning a place in the Grammy Hall of Fame and the National Recording Registry. Calloway estimated that he performed it over 40,000 times. It appeared in films, cartoons, and live shows, always carrying the same energy and magic. Even decades later, audiences still sang along, repeating the legendary call and response that made the song famous. By 1932, Calloway was not just famous, he was one of the highest-paid entertainers of his time. At just 23 years old, he was earning $50,000 a year. That number is staggering even now, but during the Great Depression, it was almost unheard of. Adjusted for today's economy, it would be worth over $850,000. While millions of Americans struggled to make a living, Calloway had turned his talent into a fortune. His success was no accident. He understood the business side of music, making sure his contracts reflected his growing influence. Many black artists were underpaid, even at the height of their success, but Calloway demanded what he was worth. His earnings came from every direction: performances at top venues, record sales, and his unmatched presence on national radio. In 1941, his orchestra was at its peak, but not everyone in the band was getting along. During a rehearsal at the State Theater in Hartford, Connecticut, Calloway spotted spitballs on the stage floor. He was strict about discipline, and he wasn't happy. Right away, he accused Dizzy Gillespie, the band's sharp-witted trumpeter, of making the mess. Gillespie denied it, but Calloway wouldn't let it go. The argument got worse. Calloway grabbed Gillespie by the lapels. In a split second, Gillespie pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the leg and wrist. The injuries weren't serious, but the shock was enough. Gillespie was fired on the spot. For years, the story spread as proof of his short temper, but later, a strange truth came out. Jonah Jones, another trumpeter, had been the real culprit. Gillespie had been kicked out over something he never did. The whole situation had spiraled out of control for no reason. Despite it all, he and Calloway eventually made peace, as their careers took them in different directions. But the spitball story remained one of jazz's most bizarre backstage tales. A few years later, Calloway faced something far worse, something that had nothing to do with music. On December 23, 1945, he was in Kansas City, planning to visit Lionel Hampton at the Plowmore Ballroom. The problem? It was a whites-only venue. Hampton had invited him personally, but when Calloway arrived, the security at the door refused to let him in. He tried to explain who he was, but things escalated fast. An off-duty police officer named William Todd stepped in. Without warning, he struck Calloway in the face with his pistol. Then he hit him again, and again. Calloway was left with a fractured finger and a deep wound in his head that needed 8 stitches. Then came the worst part. Instead of arresting the officer, the police arrested Calloway. They charged him with public intoxication and disturbing the peace, even though he hadn't been drinking. The injustice was impossible to ignore. People were outraged. Eventually, the charges were dropped, but Calloway wasn't done fighting. He sued the Plowmore for $200,000, demanding justice. The battle dragged on, and in the end, he didn't win. The attack left him scarred, but it also exposed the racism and police brutality that black entertainers faced, no matter how famous they were. Calloway wasn't just known for his music. He had strong opinions, and he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. In 1951, he did something that shook the jazz world. He called out the drug culture among musicians in an article for Ebony magazine. He didn't just talk about the problem. He named names. His goal might have been to help, but the backlash was instant. Many musicians saw it as a betrayal, a violation of the unspoken rule that personal struggles stayed within the community. No one took it harder than Miles Davis. He never forgave Calloway for putting their struggles on display. To Davis and others, it felt like Calloway wasn't trying to help. He was making himself look better at their expense. The divide wasn't just personal, it was a reflection of something bigger. Calloway came from an era where jazz was polished, where musicians followed strict rules and maintained a certain image. The new generation, led by artists like Davis, was different. They wanted freedom. They didn't want to fit into old expectations. Cab Calloway's first marriage was a mix of promise and struggle. In 1928, he married Winona Betty Conisher, a wealthy woman from Chicago. At the time, he was still trying to make a name for himself in the jazz world. Winona brought financial stability into his life, giving him a sense of comfort when he needed it most. But their relationship was never as steady as it seemed. They wanted children but couldn't have any of their own, so in 1938, they adopted a daughter named Constance. For a while, that gave them something to hold on to, but Calloway's world was too fast, too unpredictable. His life as a band leader meant constant touring, long nights, and a spotlight that never dimmed. rumors of infidelity surrounded him, and the distance between them only grew. By the early 1940s, their marriage was unraveling. They separated in 1943 and made the divorce official in 1949. Calloway later admitted that the marriage had been a mistake, but it had given him a foundation when he was still figuring things out. That same year, he remarried Zulmi Nuffy McNeil. She was different. She understood his world and became not just his wife, but his partner in every sense. As his personal life shifted, so did his career. The swing era was fading, and by the late 1940s, financial struggles forced him to disband his big band. Everything that had once felt unstoppable was beginning to change. But Calloway wasn't the kind of man to fade away. The next chapter of his life would prove that. Fatherhood brought its own challenges. Calloway had 5 daughters from different relationships. Kamei, born in 1927, Constance, his adopted daughter, and 3 more daughters, Chris, Lael, and Cabela, from his marriage to Nuffy. Balancing family and fame was never easy, but he took pride in what his children accomplished. His eldest daughter, Kamei, had perhaps the most remarkable story. She was born when Calloway was still in high school, raised by her mother, Zelma Proctor. Against the odds, she became one of the first black teachers in an all-white school in Virginia. At a time when segregation was still deeply rooted in the country, her achievement was groundbreaking. It was a moment that showed the strength of the Calloway name, the determination that ran in the family. When Calloway married Nuffy, life at home became more stable. In the 1950s, he moved his family to Westchester County, New York, where they lived in comfort. His daughter Chris followed his path into music, sometimes even sharing the stage with him. But no matter how much he tried to balance it all, there were always sacrifices. His career demanded everything, and sometimes that meant being away from his family for long stretches. Still, he made sure his children had opportunities, pushing them toward success with the same drive that had shaped his own life. Fame brought him fortune, but it also brought trouble. Calloway had more than a few run-ins with the law, some caused by his own actions, others by the racial injustice that followed him wherever he went. One of the worst incidents happened in December 1945. Calloway had been invited to the Plowmore Ballroom in Kansas City by Lionel Hampton, but when he arrived, the police at the door refused to let him in. The venue was whites only, and it didn't matter that he was a famous musician. When he protested, the officers turned violent. He was beaten, arrested, and charged with public intoxication and resisting arrest, charges he fiercely denied. The case made headlines, becoming yet another example of the discrimination black entertainers faced. In 1952, he was arrested again, this time for speeding on his way to a racetrack in Virginia. The police claimed he tried to bribe the officer, something he denied, but the accusation stuck with him. No matter how successful he was still a black man in America, and that meant trouble could find him even when he wasn't looking for it. But perhaps the most unexpected part of Calloway's story was the fact that the FBI was watching him. Like many prominent black entertainers of his time, he had caught the government's attention. The civil rights movement was growing, and federal authorities saw any outspoken black figure as a possible threat. Calloway's FBI file contained information about his activism and his ties within the entertainment world. There was no proof that he had done anything illegal, yet he was still seen as someone to monitor. This was the reality for many black artists and leaders at the time. Simply being successful and speaking out was enough to make them targets. The fall of the big band era was more than just a change in music. It was the end of a time when swing filled the dance halls and big orchestras ruled the stage. For years, the sound of brass and rhythm sections had kept America moving, but by the mid-1940s, that world was fading. A new kind of jazz was taking over. Bebop was faster, more complex, and focused on improvisation. It was exciting for musicians, but it wasn't the kind of music people could dance to. Audiences who once loved the smooth, lively swing tunes found bebop harder to follow. Musicians like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker led the movement, performing in small clubs instead of grand ballrooms. The music was bold and brilliant, but it pushed jazz in a direction that left many listeners behind. Then came the war. World War II made everything harder for big bands. Travel restrictions meant fewer tours, and fuel rationing made it expensive to go from city to city. The draft took musicians away from their instruments and into the military. Orchestras that once had full brass sections and tight rhythm groups suddenly found themselves struggling to fill seats on stage. And then there was the recording ban. From 1942 to 1944, the American Federation of Musicians halted new instrumental recordings. While singers could still record, big bands could not. It was a massive shift. The music industry, which had once been built around orchestras and band leaders, started focusing on vocalists. Frank Sinatra, who had been just another singer with Tommy Dorsey's orchestra, became a star in his own right. The spotlight was shifting. Money problems only made things worse. Big bands were expensive. They needed large venues, steady ticket sales, and constant travel to stay afloat. But wartime austerity meant ballrooms and supper clubs were closing or cutting back. Smaller nightclubs became the main places for live music, and they didn't have room for huge orchestras. Audiences changed too. People wanted something more personal. Crooners like Sinatra gave them that. Smooth, intimate songs that felt close and emotional. Swing music, once the heartbeat of America, was fading into the background. Cab Calloway saw it happening firsthand. His orchestra had been one of the biggest names in swing. His voice, his energy, and his showmanship had made him a legend at the Cotton Club in Harlem. But, as the industry changed, keeping a big band together became nearly impossible. Touring wasn't what it used to be. Costs were rising. The recording ban meant fewer chances to release new music, and audiences were turning to new sounds. Calloway refused to compromise his style by switching to smaller, stripped-down performances, but the industry was moving on. By 1948, the financial strain was too much. He had to let his orchestra go. A career that had been built on the energy of a full swing band was suddenly without a stage. With fewer opportunities in music, Calloway turned to Hollywood. He had already appeared in Stormy Weather, 1943, performing alongside legends like Lena Horne and Fats Waller. His presence was electric, his charisma undeniable. But Hollywood was still Hollywood. There were few roles for black performers, and those that existed often leaned on outdated stereotypes. Calloway was a natural entertainer, but the kinds of parts available to him were limited. Still, he kept going. He appeared in films like Porgy and Bess, 1952, sharing the screen with Sidney Poitier and Dorothy Dandridge. He made radio appearances, starred in television shows, and adapted as best he could. The music world was changing, but he refused to fade away. Beyond performing, he left a different kind of mark. He wrote Cab Calloway's Hepster's Dictionary, a guide to the slang of the jazz world. It was more than just a collection of words. It was a record of a culture, a way of speaking that defined a generation of musicians and fans. At a time when jazz itself was being reshaped, Calloway made sure its history wasn't forgotten. But for all his success, Calloway faced obstacles that had nothing to do with talent. Being a black entertainer in America meant fighting against racism at every turn. Even at the height of his fame, he wasn't given the same opportunities as white performers. In Hollywood, he was cast in supporting roles instead of leads. On tour, segregation dictated where he could stay, where he could eat, and even where he could perform. Some venues welcomed him as a star, while others refused to let him in the front door. One night in 1945, while performing in Kansas City, Calloway was assaulted by police officers. He was one of the biggest names in music, but in that moment, none of it mattered. It was a harsh reminder that no level of fame could fully protect a black artist from the reality of segregation. Even financially, he was treated differently. He had sold millions of records, but the rewards were never the same as those given to white artists. While Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra were pushed to the front of the industry, black musicians like Calloway had to fight for recognition and fair pay. His influence was undeniable, but the system wasn't built for him to thrive in the same way. Cab Calloway's return to the spotlight with the Blues Brothers wasn't just a comeback. It was a moment that reminded the world why he had been a star in the first place. In the film, he played Curtis, the wise and charismatic janitor who had guided Jake and Elwood Blues when they were young. But when the time came for him to perform, he didn't just step into the role of a mentor. He became the Cab Calloway people had fallen in love with decades earlier. Dressed in his signature white tie and tails, he took the stage with a dazzling performance of Minnie the Moocher. The moment was electric. His voice was strong, his presence was commanding, and for those few minutes, it felt like time had rewound to the 1930s. Audiences who had never heard his name before were suddenly captivated. Those who remembered him from his prime saw that nothing had changed. He still had the energy, the showmanship, and the effortless charm that had made him famous. Director John Landis knew exactly what he was doing when he cast Calloway. He wasn't just adding an old legend for nostalgia. He wanted someone who could embody the spirit of a true performer. Alongside Calloway, the film featured other musical icons like Aretha Franklin, James Brown, and Ray Charles. Together, they created something special, a bridge between generations, a celebration of the music that had shaped so much of what came after. Calloway's scene became one of the film's most unforgettable moments. His performance was so powerful that it didn't just leave an impact on the audience in the theater. Decades later, clips from the Blues Brothers would still play at basketball games, bringing his energy to new crowds who had never even heard his name. Critics and fans agreed. He stole the show. His song had been written nearly 50 years earlier, but it didn't feel old, it felt alive. And in 1999, Minnie the Moocher was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, recognized as one of the greatest recordings in American history. But for Calloway, the Blues Brothers wasn't just about reliving the past. It was about proving that he still belonged on that stage. And he did. Even as the years passed, the recognition kept coming. In 1993, when he was 85 years old, he stood in the White House as President Bill Clinton placed the National Medal of Arts around his neck. It was a tribute to everything he had achieved. A career that had broken barriers and redefined what was possible for a black entertainer in America. Calloway had made history in the 1930s, becoming the first African-American musician to sell over 1 million records. He had been the first to host a nationally syndicated radio show. Now, even long after his peak, his impact was still being honored. In 2008, more than a decade after his passing, he was awarded the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. His influence hadn't faded. It had grown. Minnie the Moocher had already been celebrated, but in 2019, it was added to the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry, recognized for its cultural and historical importance. These weren't just awards. They were reminders that Calloway's voice, his style, and his spirit had shaped American music in ways that would never be forgotten. But his legacy wasn't just about what he had accomplished. It was about the people he had inspired. His performances had set a standard, showing musicians how to command a stage, how to hold an audience in the palm of their hand. Artists like James Brown and Michael Jackson studied his moves. Even hip-hop artists would later point to him as one of the earliest examples of rhythmic storytelling. His band was more than just a group of musicians. It was a training ground for some of jazz's greatest talents. Dizzy Gillespie, Ben Webster, and Milt Hinton all played under Calloway before becoming legends in their own right. He didn't just lead a band. He shaped the future of jazz. Decades later, his name still carries weight. Director John Landis once said, "Cab Calloway is hip-hop." He meant that Calloway's energy, his style, and his ability to captivate a crowd had set the stage for what would come next. Even today, schools like the Cab Calloway School of the Arts in Delaware keep his legacy alive, training young performers in music and theater, ensuring that his influence continues. When he passed away in 1994 at the age of 86, he didn't leave behind just a few hit songs. He left behind a legacy, a way of performing that changed everything, a spirit of showmanship that still lives on. He wasn't just part of history, he helped write it.